Okay, so we're recording now. Okay, so this is our judging guide for Western high schools tournament. So we're going to be assuming that we're operating under the format of like what we're doing for high schools, like the timing format where we're doing 5-minute speeches and stuff like that. But the timing itself doesn't really impact this judging guide too much. Like maybe the speaker scores will shift here and there. Maybe you'll have like longer speeches at a university tournament. But in general, I think this will be a good introduction for whether you want to judge a high school or a university tournament. So as a quick thing for everyone that might not be familiar with this, I want to go over some housekeeping rules of like how you want to start the debate as a judge if you are slotted as a chair, because it's no guarantee that you would be. But regardless, this is kind of like what we begin with. So the first is to introduce yourself and your panelists, obviously, and your pronouns. This is optional. So if you don't want to disclose your pronouns, that's completely fine. But please do indicate if you have any preferred ones. And also this gives the opportunity for other people to do so as well. So the next thing you want to do is like, I guess you can ask for team codes, but regardless, you just kind of want to go team by team. So starting from opening government to opening opposition to closing government to closing opposition, asking for their names, their speaker orders, and their pronouns if the speakers are comfortable disclosing, in which case, if they're not, then don't pressure them to do so. Make sure you take down their speaking order as well. So you make sure that people throughout the debate are addressing people properly. So if someone misgenders someone, you should be able to identify that and make sure that doesn't happen. But also you want to make sure you kind of like know how people want to be addressed by other people. I think that's also really important. So then we ask that debaters refer to speakers who do not disclose their pronouns using gender neutral language. So for example, the prime minister, the previous speaker, their name, for example. It just all around makes the debate a lot better. So try to enforce those things. It just like minimizes like the cases that equity has to kind of deal with if that happens. So as a judge, we expect you guys to be attentive to what's happening in the round. You guys are administering the debate, so it's your responsibility to make sure the debate runs smoothly, to make sure everyone is comfortable within those spaces. Okay, next, ask speakers to indicate how they like POIs before they begin their speech. So this is also really important. Some speakers get really anxious if people unmute themselves, for example, and ask POI. So making sure that you indicate what your POI preference is and making sure that that is enforced adequately by the chair. So basically, for example, if someone were to unmute, you want to really emphasize the fact that, these speakers have preferences that you have to fulfill as other speakers and like this obligation that you have. So making sure that that is also done is also really important for making sure the debate environment is something that is friendly, accessible, and not intimidating for a lot of debaters, especially since at a high school tournament, these are, still kids, right? This might be some of their first tournaments like ever. So making sure that they have a good introduction to the activity and like the debating circuit as a whole is super, super important. So don't underestimate the role that you have as a judge in being able to set that kind of environment for people. Okay, timing. Let me see. This is stuff for like later on, like more specific stuff about like, time signals with like the Discord bots and everything. But regardless, it's 5 minutes, 30-second speeches for high school tournaments. 5 minutes, 50-second speeches for high school tournaments, 7 minutes for university. This isn't that important. Okay, so another quick rule is to understand the standard of knowledge. And this is going to be very arbitrary. It's going to be kind of vague, but I'll try my best to explain how this kind of works. So the judge's perspective should be that of a globally informed citizen, right? So the globally informed citizen reads major newspapers casually on a daily basis. This is like a really strange way to define it. And we kind of just like picked it up out of like the Wudick handbook. Because like even this, I don't even know what this is supposed to mean, right? But basically, the bottom line of what this means is you don't want to be very interventionist as a judge. And what interventionist means here, or judges should not intervene, is basically you don't want to insert your own knowledge into the round, right? So for example, if the debaters are debating a motion that you know a lot about, but they're not making any of the arguments that are the correct ones, or not using knowledge properly, in that round, or like they're misusing certain pieces of information. Unless that misuse of information is like extremely blatant, you want to assume that that argument stands insofar as other teams don't engage with it. So you want to be evaluating on the round purely what is being said by the debaters and not what you think is the personally correct like decision. So for example, there's been many instances where I'm judging a round, and I'm sure many upper years who are judging the round might have a specific opinion on a specific motion that they've kind of come across at a tournament. But they will have to give like the win to a team that we completely disagree with, not because we agree with not because we were like convinced by them per se, but just that other teams did not engage adequately with the arguments that are being presented. So you want to be non-interventionist as possible. You want to be objective and impartial as possible when evaluating these kinds of things, making sure that you're not inserting yourself into the round, making sure that round is something that is purely being evaluated on like what people are saying specifically. That's also really important. Okay, sounds good. And like as an example of like any factual flaws that are known by the globally informed citizen, like if something's blatantly wrong, like for example, just like if a team says like the United States never intervenes in like the Middle East or something like that, well, that one doesn't really matter whether or not other teams kind of call them out on it, because what they're saying is kind of just incorrect, right? So you want to discount their argument on those bases. But if it's like small things, you want to make sure that you're not inserting yourself. Okay. Oh, I guess I kind of addressed this already. Evaluate privilege says by speakers, clear what happened during the round to avoid biasing. Yeah, so this is the idea of note taking and making sure you clearly write what happens during the round. This is really, really important, especially since debaters, especially at high school tournaments, oftentimes will ask you for feedback as well. I'll go through this point really quickly, and then I'll go to another like tab that I have open for how to take notes, and then I'll come back to this presentation. But the next point is addressing failures in role fulfillment. So you want to penalize speakers based on the nature of that failure, how it impacted the ability for the arguments to stand, and how it may have jeopardized the quality of the round. So for example, right, the most clear example is like, let's say you're evaluating like the opening government team, and the prime minister failed to do things like give a proper model, and as such, the debate became very messy, and it was very hard for them to evaluate very hard for you to evaluate the opening government's team's arguments in the round. If that's the case, then you should penalize them on those aspects. But at the end of the day, even role fulfillment kind of comes secondary or even tertiary to a lot of the other things that you want to be addressing as a judge. So for example, the primary one is what arguments were made, how did they weigh against each other and stuff like that. But these are just some things that you can also include into your like feedback or your reason for a decision. So as for the judging template that I like to use, and I'll share this with you guys later, and I'm pretty sure I've probably shared it with you guys many times in the past, is the judging template that I personally use. And this works for me. This doesn't have to work for you. I know everyone takes notes differently, but for me, I use this kind of table where I write the specific arguments that each individual speaker is making. So the PM, the LO, the DPM, the DLO, blah, 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 blah. And what this means then, I'm able to keep very clear track of exactly what each team or each speaker is saying, what each team is saying, and therefore, and also like who said it. So for example, as well, if you're valuing the back half team and you notice that a lot of their arguments came out of the whip speaker rather than like the member of government speaker or the member of opposition speaker, you can penalize them on those grounds as well for saying, well, a lot of this material didn't really come out soon enough. Et cetera, et cetera. So that would be an example of like role fulfillment issues as well that we kind of just talked about. That comes in consideration in conjunction with the arguments that people make. So this is kind of how I take notes. Okay, sounds good. So next, let's talk about weighing arguments. How do you want to weigh different teams above or below each other? And this is like the more intimidating thing, or one of the more things that take a little bit more practice to kind of get used to. But there are four main things you kind of want to consider, three of which I think are the most important, which is the validity, the relevance, the impact, and the fourth, you could probably talk about principle. And we'll go through each four of these things. So let's talk about validity, right? On validity, what does it mean? In last week's seminar, I kind of talked about how arguments are constructed on two main kind of axes. How true it is versus how important it is, and basically, validity is just about weighing how true an argument is, how well a team is mechanized or proven their impacts to follow from their premises. So notably here, this does not mean you bring in specialized knowledge from your thesis or academic career to try to devalue arguments, right? For this, guys, it kind of goes into like the idea of like not being interventionist. But what this basically means is you want to evaluate what are the impacts that were said by each team and how well did each team prove those impacts to exist or to not exist. And that's kind of the idea about, that's kind of what we mean by addressing teams based on validity. how true they are, whether or not they've sufficiently proven an impact to actually take place. So for example, right, let's say like in an IR round, someone talks about an impact being something policy, like, I don't know, denuclearization is going to happen, or you can maybe talk about how like maybe a speaker will say like nuclear war happens as a result of something. If they're not able to prove that to be true, or that to actually follow from their premises, then that is not something they should credit very highly. So they lose based on validity. And again, you want to always be weighing this against other teams. So for example, it could conceptually be true that all four teams in the debate don't really provide many valid arguments. Maybe these four teams don't really prove to you why their impacts are going to follow. So when that happens, you want to consider, well, given that all the teams didn't really prove something's going to happen like that well, which team comparatively does it better to others? So for example, what did OG say to prove their things were true? And what did OO say to prove their things were true? And as a result, which side better proves the thing that they were saying were true, right? So that's kind of how you want to weigh things based on validity. The next is on relevance. So relevance is basically arguments that are true, but are unclear as to how important they are when weighing them in your evaluation of the round. So for example, right, an argument about how free healthcare leads to better quality of life in a round about banning zoos, sure, it's probably going to be the case that you can prove that free healthcare leads to better quality of life. That argument's probably valid. But if a round is about banning zoos, then this is not relevant to the round, even if it's true, even if it has higher impact. So you want to understand, well, in the context of this round, which arguments should we kind of be evaluating or weighing more than others? So which arguments more relevant to the spirit of the motion or the debate that's happening at hand? The next one, for example, is an argument about how banning zoos leads to more concern for animal conservation protection efforts. So for example, you could probably feasibly argue that maybe it's the case that banning zoos leading to more concern for animal conservation and protection efforts is maybe less important than talking about getting everyone free healthcare, right? In terms of impacts. But even if it's less important in terms of impacts, this is probably going to be significantly more true in this debate. It's probably also going to be more relevant than the previous argument about healthcare as well. So therefore, this argument will weigh heavier because one, the argument is proven to be true and valid, proven to be presumably important. And also in this case, you're able to prove that this argument is significantly more relevant when considering what arguments you want to weigh in the round. The next is the idea of impacting. So this is the idea of importance, right? And arguments may have drastically different scales of practical impacts. And in very certain specific cases, it makes sense to weigh based on the extent of these impacts. So for example, an argument 1 impacts 10 people versus argument 2 impacts 10,000 people. You're probably likely going to weigh argument 1 less than argument 2. But what's important to note here as well is that people still have to justify why their argument impacts more people. Because, for example, as we want to tie back into the earlier idea of validity, there are many cases where a team may, say that there's a very high impact from something. So, for example, if you're talking about a social justice round, you can say, well, this ends racism, or this leads to the emancipation of X group of people. But insofar as that policy itself is unclear to the extent to which that actually meaningfully creates those impacts, then even if that impact is high and should be important, you will still weigh it under the argument that is more marginal, but is proven to be true. So for example, let's say, take this argument, right? Let's say one team says an argument impacts 10 people and the other team says the argument impacts 10,000 people, right? But so seemingly, if both of these arguments are proven to be true, obviously the second one is significantly more important. But if the team that is arguing or hinging their entire case on the idea that 10,000 people are going to benefit from something are unable to prove why those 10,000 people are going to be benefited, then you will give it to, argument 1, because even though it's more marginal, it's more likely to happen. Therefore, it's more likely to be considered in the round. Therefore, it's weighed heavier than the other argument. And that's on the idea of impacting. Finally, on principle. So sometimes certain arguments cannot simply be weighed on the quality of impact due to principles that may be more important. So this comes up a little bit less often in debating, but it can happen. And usually they're not very successful because they're hard to make. But let's take the best case scenario if people are able to make a proper principled arguments, right? So for example, 1, let's say arguments made about vulnerable populations may be more likely to be weighed heavier, even if there's less of an overall quantitative impact. So for example, arguments talking about benefiting minority communities are still valid and important, even if they don't benefit the majority of people, right? So let's say, for example, in this case, you're talking about like a very typical one, I guess, like a very typical like motion type is like this house will do X thing for like the vast majority of society, like maybe taxing rich people or like wealthy people, and then like, you know, funneling that into like social programs for like poorer people, right? Or making that a part of reparations for like racial minorities, for example. Those kinds of arguments are a good example of this, right? Where it's, even though maybe this negatively, quote unquote, affects people in society, where you're obviously taking more of their money, taxing them more and stuff like that. There's a principle here that needs to be upheld, which is the principle of reparations, that we need to bring justice to a lot of the people who have been affected by racial injustice and stuff like that. So even if, for example, the group of people that you benefit is significantly smaller, so you have like less impact numbers or something, like whatever, like less utility numbers or like utility points or whatever, that still doesn't matter, because there's a more important thing that you need to be trying to uphold, which in many cases could be racial justice, racial emancipation, stuff like that are all really important to kind of weigh as well. So, you know, you can't just let teams get away by saying, well, we benefit more people, therefore, blah, blah, blah. They have to prove why the specific stakeholders they're identifying are the most important stakeholders in the round. And in my document about how to judge, you'll see more details as to how to kind of evaluate that. But, you know, you have to make sure that teams are really justifying why we should care about certain groups more than others. The second is arguments be about the morality of a particular course of action, even if they lead to greater practical benefits in the long term. So for example, right, let's say we're talking about something like the death penalty, right? It's probably feasibly true that you can prove to some extent, with enough mitigation and framing from a team, you could probably prove that the death penalty can lead to utility benefits for society, because, you know, you get criminals off the street, it costs less to like, you know, house convicted criminals and stuff like that for very heinous crimes. So, you know, this might create a safer society technically, so based on utility. But you can maybe say that, you know, in the context of the death penalty, you can maybe say that there is a moral wrong that's being done, in one maybe saying it's unjustified to murder someone under any circumstance, to kill someone under any circumstance regardless of what they do. Maybe you can say that the state should never have the principled ability to execute like one of their citizens. Maybe these are all things that you can argue that even if it creates less utility for like society, you know, maybe it's probably going to be the case that it's going to be more expensive. Maybe you risk like these like really like heinous criminals like from like getting out of jail, stuff like, I don't know, like obviously that's probably going to be more true on like the other side. But if you're able to prove that there's a moral duty that exists that you need to uphold, so not killing people, then therefore you'll weigh that above the other team. These are arguments that are harder to make, and you'll see them significantly less often, so don't worry about them too much. But this is just to kind of note that they do exist and they can factor into evaluation depending on like what the round is about. Oh yeah, sorry, and like one quick thing as well, on this argument, another good one that we kind of thought about at our previous high school tournaments is like, you know, something about whether or not the like trials should be done by judge or by jury or something like that. And basically that's a good example, because some teams might argue that, well, it's good to just do it by judge only, because the judge can just make the decision, and like and like the trial process goes by faster. And like, sure, maybe that could be good, but you know, the other team can say, well, we're willing to bite the bullet of having longer trial time, spending like years and years on a trial, if that means we get to a more accurate outcome, especially considering that trials are literally dictating how that affects people's rest of like their lives, right? So that's a good example of like morality taking precedent over like morality taking, I don't like the way that I'm wording this, but it's like that's an example of like something that creates less societal like utility points or whatever, like outweighing that of like another decision that might expedite certain processes, make things a lot more efficient. Okay, so the next idea is whether a team is derivative, and you'll see this in like the guide that I'll send you guys later as well. But basically what derivative means is like, it plays on this tradition of debaters just like liking to like co-opt like math terms, or for some reason, where it's basically just like, has this team's arguments been derived from like the, you know, other team's arguments. So basically, this is most relevant to the back half teams when they're evaluating whether or not they can create new material or unique material from their opening half. So an extension can be considered different and valid in three circumstances, right? The first is if they brought up genuinely new material. You know, if your argument's new, Great, awesome. We can weigh that against the other, like their opening half, and see whether or not your argument's better. The second is if the material uses some of the same material, but it's put in different contexts where it's much more impactful and much more relevant. So for example, if a debate is as it happens very often in like the Western debating circuits, focuses on like the United States or like Canada and like Western countries, but a team can kind of explain, well, for these same reasons, here's why this is more relevant in like the developing world, in places like China, places like India. If they're able to prove that, then even though some of their material uses similar arguments, if we're able to prove why that argument can be used for more impactful ends or impactful arguments and a better characterization of like how this affects other like types, like groups of people, then that becomes a lot more important than their front half. The third is if the material mechanizes and brings up ways to reach impacts that the front half was weak in explaining. So for example, it's probably feasibly the case that, both teams could arrive at very similar conclusions, right? You could have the same impact of this, benefits or harms X social justice movement, for example, right? Or X group of disenfranchised people. In those cases, right? This doesn't mean that the opening half can always truly prove why that exists better. So for example, you'll see in the guide that I kind of wrote later on as well, an example that I made was if you're talking about why a policy produces racist outcomes, right? A opening government team could maybe say, well, rich white men are oftentimes elected as politicians. They're the heads of government. They're the ones that make the laws. So therefore, these laws are going to produce racist outcomes. This is decently true. Like there's a good amount of truth to it. But if a back half team says, well, independent of whether or not rich white men are elected, this policy reinforces a system of systemic racism that reproduces itself for X and X, Y, Z reasons, meaning that, it's not just the idea that, rich white men get elected as politicians, but it is a significantly deeper, more entrenched issue than just who we elect to make our laws. Then even those two outcomes are the same in terms of both teams proved a certain impact on racial minorities, and both teams have somewhat true arguments to prove why this is going to happen. I think the CG team does a better job at explaining the true nature of what systemic racism is and how that manifests. So that could also be a valid form of extension, right? An important thing to note here is that a derivative team may still nonetheless be better than teams on the other side of the bench. A derivative team does not auto for. So do evaluate how they engage with other teams as well, and whether the refutation and weighing puts them over teams on the opposite bench. So for example, right, in the previous argument, let's say for example, a team is completely derivative. Let's say, CG is completely derivative from OG. This does not mean you go, oh, they were derivative for, they didn't do what they were expected to do. Rather, all this means is at best, or at worst, they take it under their opening half. So CG takes it under OG because they were derivative. But you still have to evaluate how CG stacked up against CO and how they stacked against OO. So, they could take a 2, they could take a 3, they could take a 4, regardless of what happens. But a derivative call is oftentimes something that places the team automatically under their opening half. Okay, sounds good. I think this should be it then. I'll stop the seminar just because it is around 20 something minute mark. 1 second.